They thought it was only a formal family portrait until the light in the father's eyes refused to catch. In the early hours of January 3, 2026, Dr. Elise Harrington sat alone in the climate-controlled vault of the Philadelphia Historical Society. The temperature was held at a constant 18 degrees Celsius. The air smelled faintly of old paper, leather bindings, and the chemical residue of 19th-century albumen prints. Outside, the city was still dark and quiet under a thin layer of late winter snow. A heavy wooden crate had arrived 2 days earlier from the estate of Margaret Ellison, who had died at the age of 101 in her large stone house in Chestnut Hill. The crate contained 287 photographs spanning the years 1879 to 1914. Most were the expected stiff group portraits, wedding parties, solemn children in white dresses, and formal gatherings of prosperous Philadelphia families. One image, however, refused to be ordinary. It was a large cabinet card mounted on thick cream board with gilt edges that had softened with age. The date written in pencil on the reverse was March 1897. The photograph showed a prosperous family of 6 arranged in a dark, heavily draped parlor. Heavy velvet curtains framed a tall window that let in only a soft, diffuse light. The father sat in a high-backed oak chair at the exact center of the composition. His wife stood slightly behind his right shoulder, one gloved hand resting on him with unnatural tension. 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, were placed around the pair with careful, almost ceremonial formality. Everyone wore deep black. At first glance, it looked like a standard memorial portrait of the Gilded Age, the kind families commissioned when death had taken someone important, and they wished to preserve the appearance of dignity and unity. But Elise had spent nearly 2 decades studying the visual language of 19th-century photography, and something in the image felt profoundly wrong. The father's head was tilted at an angle no living man would hold for the long exposure required by the camera of that era. His left hand lay too heavily on the carved arm of the chair. The fingers were curled inward in a way that suggested they had been arranged after the muscles had already begun to stiffen. The youngest girl, no more than 7 years old, had eyes that were visibly swollen even in the soft focus of the print. The oldest boy's jaw was locked so tightly that a tendon stood out along the side of his neck. The mother's free hand resting on her husband's shoulder showed white knuckles and a faint tremor that the long exposure had recorded as a soft, ghostly blur. Behind them, on the marble mantel, a large arrangement of white lilies partially concealed a folded document. Elise put on white cotton gloves, lifted the card with both hands, and carried it to the Society's digital microscope. Under magnification, the surface of the photograph became a landscape of quiet revelation. A thin, dark line crossed the father's throat just above the stiff collar, a ligature mark that someone had tried and failed to conceal with powder. Tiny broken capillaries ringed both eyes like a constellation of red stars. The skin of his face had the waxy, slightly collapsed quality of a body that had been dead for at least a day and a half. The light that should have caught in living eyes was simply absent. On the mantel, half hidden by the lilies, the folded document bore one legible word: coroner. She photographed every detail at high resolution, then began the slow, methodical work of reconstruction that would occupy the next 8 months of her life. The reverse of the card carried the photographer's stamp in elegant script: H. L. Whitmore and Company, Artistic Photographers, 1122 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, 1897. The studio's ledgers had survived in the city archives, stored in a dusty basement that still smelled of coal smoke and old ink. On March 14, 1897, there was a single relevant entry written in careful copperplate handwriting. Memorial Portrait, Mr. Edward Langston, deceased, of 27 Rittenhouse Square. Wife and 4 children present. Special instructions from Mrs. Langston regarding the arrangement of the body, the lighting, the position of the hands, and the placement of certain papers on the mantel. Paid in full, cash. No further copies requested. Client declined the usual retouching of the face and neck. Newspaper accounts from the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Public Ledger were strangely brief and carefully worded. Edward Langston, 47 years old, senior partner in the shipping firm of Langston and Whitfield, had been found dead in his private study on the night of March 11, 1897. The first report listed the cause as apoplexy. An inquest was ordered the following morning. 3 days later, the official verdict was returned without fanfare: accidental death caused by a fall against the iron fender of the fireplace. Elise requested the complete coroner's file from the Philadelphia City Archives. The request took 6 weeks to process. When the brittle, foxed pages finally arrived, what she found inside was far more disturbing than any newspaper had ever printed. The examining physician, Dr. Samuel Rhett, had recorded a depressed fracture of the left temporal bone, extensive bruising around the neck, consistent with a narrow cord or wire, dense petechial hemorrhages in both conjunctivae, a fractured hyoid bone, and defensive abrasions on both palms and the inner forearms. In a private note that had never been entered into the public record, folded and tucked into the back of the file, Dr. Rhett had written in a tight, angry hand, "Death by strangulation following a preliminary blow to the head. This is homicide. I recommend immediate criminal investigation. I have been advised, however, that further inquiry would be considered unwise." Yet the official ruling remained accidental. The testimony preserved in the file explained, with cold clarity, why the truth had been buried. Edward Langston had discovered that his junior partner, Charles Whitfield, had been systematically embezzling from the firm's accounts for nearly 4 years. The amounts were substantial. On the evening of the 11th of March, the two men had argued violently behind the closed door of the study. The eldest son, 16-year-old Thomas Langston, testified that he heard raised voices, the sound of a heavy body striking furniture, a brief struggle, and then silence. A few moments later, he saw Whitfield leave by the side door, adjusting his shirt cuffs as he walked quickly toward the street. The housekeeper, a woman named Bridie O'Connor, confirmed the same sequence of events and added that she had heard Mr. Langston shout the words, "You will not take what is not yours," shortly before the struggle began. Mrs. Margaret Langston herself stated that her husband had intended to take the firm's ledgers to the police the following morning. She had seen the books open on his desk only hours before his death. None of it mattered. Charles Whitfield's sister was married to a senior judge on the Court of Common Pleas. 2 detectives who had begun preliminary inquiries were transferred within 48 hours to distant precincts. Bridie O'Connor left the city within a week and was never located again. Her name disappeared from city directories after March 1897. Margaret Langston received 3 anonymous letters in the days that followed, each warning her that further questions would place her children in danger. The final letter contained a small lock of hair that matched the color of her youngest daughter's. The letters were never reported to the police. 3 days after the official verdict was published, Margaret Langston commissioned the photograph. She gave precise and unusual instructions to the photographer. The body was not to be fully prepared by the undertaker. The ligature mark was to remain visible. The children were to be arranged so that their faces, grief, suppressed rage, hollow shock, and pure childish terror, would be permanently recorded by the camera. She insisted that the lighting be soft and even, so that no dramatic shadows could be used later to claim the image had been altered. And on the mantel, half concealed by the funeral lilies, she placed the coroner's preliminary report so that someday, if anyone ever looked closely enough, the truth might still be read. For 128 years, the photograph remained in a drawer, passed down through the family as simply grandfather's last portrait. No one spoke of the night Edward Langston died. The children grew up under the weight of a silence that had been forced upon them. Thomas never fully recovered the easy confidence he had shown before that night. The youngest girl, whose swollen eyes were still visible in the photograph, rarely spoke of her childhood at all. Margaret Langston lived another 39 years. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly of her husband's death. But she kept the photograph, and she kept the 3 anonymous letters, and she kept the private note Dr. Rhett had written, folded carefully inside a small leather case. In September 2026, Elise Harrington mounted an exhibition at the Philadelphia Historical Society titled "What the Light Refused to Hide: The Langston Photograph." The original cabinet card was displayed under carefully controlled lighting beside large format enlargements of the throat mark, the children's expressions, the blurred tremor in the mother's hand, and the half-hidden document on the mantel. Beside the photograph lay the coroner's original notes, the suppressed testimony, the 3 anonymous letters, and a single page from the firm's ledgers that Margaret had somehow managed to preserve. showing the first clear evidence of the embezzlement her husband had discovered. On the second afternoon of the exhibition, a woman in her late 70s stood for a long time in front of the glass case. Her name was Eleanor Langston Price, great-granddaughter of Edward and Margaret. She had traveled from Portland, Oregon after reading a small notice about the exhibition in a national magazine. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, and her eyes were wet. She never stopped believing that someone would look closely enough. She used the only weapon left to her, the photograph itself. She made the camera record what the courts refused to acknowledge. She arranged her children's faces so that their fear and anger would outlast every official lie. Thank you for seeing what she left for us, across more than a century of silence. The portrait had done exactly what Margaret Langston had intended on that cold March day in 1897. It had carried the truth through generations of enforced quiet, waiting for a pair of eyes careful enough to notice that the light in the father's eyes had never belonged to the living. And in the soft glow of the exhibition lights, the thin dark line across his throat remained visible still. Undeniable, unsoftened by time, and finally, after 129 years, no longer alone.